No one expected that the final days of April 1945 would turn out to be not only chaos and smoke, but also a carefully engineered maneuver hidden within layers of documents, formalities, and false trails. Historians are used to seeing the underground chambers beneath the ruined city as the end. But parallel to the collapse existed a design for an escape, not a reckless dash, but a chain of procedures, travel authorizations, medical transport forms, and train schedules. Each link looked perfectly ordinary, leaving no reason for suspicion. The story of this plan has since been pieced together from fragments, dry transport records, field medics' notes, stamps on supply boxes, photo logs, and Allied reports that later connected traces found both in Europe and on Pacific Islands. In Berlin, the plan was referred to by a meaningless codename, Evacuation Protocol of Command in Case of Bombardment. Outwardly, it resembled known directives, but inside it contained a split structure in which the real purpose was dissolved among dozens of plausible operations. The core of the plan was the system of medical corridors. When shells tore through the streets and every movement became visible, only vehicles marked with red crosses retained limited passage rights through military checkpoints. In reality, these permissions were fragile and often fictitious, but for short stretches, they allowed the transfer of small, unnoticed groups. The organizers possessed authentic lists of the wounded, invoices for bandages and morphine, and detailed hospital supply ledgers. Among these legitimate lines were hidden neutral names and initials placeholders under which key individuals were meant to be moved. The second layer involved the railways. Amid the retreat's confusion, train stations operated on schedules that were no longer followed but still printed. Some trains left nearly empty. Others stood idle for days. The plan relied on timing, narrow windows when a medical train, formally bound for the rear to evacuate the severely wounded, could alter its route under the pretext of delivering bandages or surgical instruments. On paper, everything appeared logical. Medical manifests listed oxygen units, gurneys, and antiseptics. Meanwhile, several trusted officers distributed these documents among different routes so that each controller saw only a fragment, never the full picture. The third layer, the maritime one, relied on Europe's collapsing coastal networks. Pre-war links to neutral ports had vanished, yet the northern shores still provided rare opportunities for passage aboard small vessels. In records, this was described as transfer of sanitary supplies along the coastal line. Under that label traveled motorboats loaded with boxes of medical glassware and disinfectants. The boxes did contain real dressings and ointments, but also sealed envelopes with alternate identification papers, adjusted photographs, and ration cards under fabricated names. The concept was simple. A person would move through several points, each time appearing as a courier or medical assistant rather than a fugitive. The realism of this structure is confirmed by striking parallels found in Allied sources. On Pacific Islands, Allied medics recorded episodes in which rescue crews provided first aid to captured enemy soldiers, following strict protocol, stopping bleeding, disinfecting wounds, immobilizing fractures, ensuring hydration, and documenting every action precisely. These reports were deliberately neutral, describing procedures minute by minute without moral commentary. The parallel lies in the bureaucracy itself. By the war's end, both sides had developed an instinct to document every humanitarian act. In Europe, even amid ruin, every bandage applied sought to be recorded. Every stop of a medical truck marked by notes on the consumption of gauze and iodine. That reflex, the bureaucratic trail, was what the escape plan sought to exploit. In early April, several shipments labeled as medical supplies were dispatched through separate routes. Inside the crates were not weapons, but components of new identities. Family photographs showing men in civilian clothes, pre-war magazines with marked pages, membership cards from trade associations dated retroactively. These details didn't guarantee safety, but offered a chance to dissolve into the flow of refugees and the wounded. Each checkpoint was supposed to simulate routine logistics. Unloading, recounting stretchers, checking inventory lists, nothing unusual, just dull paperwork. Communication with the coast was maintained through shortwave signals, mentioning no names, only parameters, the number of stretcher teams, the weight of boxes, tide schedules. Under normal circumstances, it might have looked like a coded scheme. But by the war's end, all radio traffic sounded chaotic. In that noise, the plan blended in seamlessly. It depended on the assumption that Allied intelligence would focus on the obvious arteries, highways, airfields, and evacuation convoys, while the narrow medical routes, the capillaries of the system, would remain overlooked. The drama of the situation lay in its paradox. The closer the total collapse came, the more valuable predictability became. Medics continued logging bandage shortages, field instructors double-checked first aid kits, and quartermasters recorded alcohol use for disinfection. On the Pacific Islands, Allied medics worked from identical checklists, treating wounded prisoners, dressing their injuries, and documenting results dispassionately. This mechanical professionalism, the discipline of humanitarian order amid chaos, created narrow corridors in which the final escape plan survived. It did not rely on speed. It relied on humanity's habit of following procedure. By May, according to reconstructed timelines, only a few critical transitions remained. One was a short northern railway leg, where a hospital car was to change both its number and escort unnoticed. Another was an unofficial pier, where a barge, nominally loaded with laboratory glass, was to take aboard an additional sealed crate. Around those same days, on a remote Pacific atoll, Allied medics logged: first aid provided to 3 prisoners, condition stabilized, transferred under guard. The lines never intersected. Yet they illustrated how the discipline of medical record-keeping inadvertently gave the escape plan its cloak of legitimacy. It almost succeeded precisely because it was designed as the shadow of a routine. We could not believe, years later, how detailed the reconstruction became once the fragments were compared. The escape plan that had been dismissed as rumor revealed itself through meticulous documentation found in Europe and on isolated Pacific bases. Researchers studying captured German archives discovered that certain sanitary convoys listed in Berlin's medical department reports never arrived at their recorded destinations. These were not combat units, but field hospital columns, supposedly transporting supplies for the wounded. Their inventories matched reality too well to seem suspicious. Disinfectants, gauze, intravenous sets, gloves. Yet, within these convoys existed invisible compartments, small, sealed areas listed as equipment storage or laboratory crates. The pattern appeared again in Allied shipping logs. Somewhere across the world, similar notations were found in the manifests of naval vessels that had intercepted adrift medical boats without understanding their origin. The logistics of disappearance depended not on cunning disguises, but on paperwork's inertia. Once a document had a signature and a medical stamp, it belonged to a bureaucratic reality that was almost sacred amid wartime disorder. No soldier questioned an order bearing the Red Cross insignia, especially one signed by a doctor. Historians later confirmed that the German Military Medical Corps had maintained higher internal discipline than most other branches by the war's end. The plan exploited that credibility. It moved not through hidden tunnels or secret planes, but through the blind spots of official order, those places where trust in documentation outweighed human observation. Each leg of the escape route was designed as a temporary illusion. A convoy would appear at a supply depot, unload authentic medical gear, collect new consignments, and move again, its personnel lists changing slightly each time. The added names were clerical, often indistinguishable from those of ordinary medics. Somewhere between Saxony and the Baltic coast, these temporary staff records vanished into destroyed archives, leaving no evidence of who had boarded which vehicle. It was only decades later that analysts noticed the repetition of identical handwriting on several unrelated documents, suggesting a single clerk had prepared multiple rosters for different routes. One of the most compelling findings emerged from Allied medical logs in the Pacific Theater. In several cases, American and Australian field units reported encounters with survivors of unidentified ships claiming to be medical auxiliaries. These survivors were treated according to standard humanitarian procedure: wounds cleaned, fractures splinted, dehydration corrected, pulse and respiration noted. Once stabilized, they were transferred to detention areas. Nothing in their behavior distinguished them from other shipwrecked personnel. However, the documents show discrepancies in language use and knowledge of geography. A few of the patients spoke in fragmented phrases that did not align with the naval dialects of the Pacific Axis forces. This oddity was noted, filed, and forgotten only to resurface decades later when the same linguistic traces were compared with European archives. In the European segment of the story, the final weeks of the war blurred command structures. German hospitals were overwhelmed, their corridors filled with refugees, medics, and soldiers awaiting reassignment. Within that chaos, several hospital trains traveled under false or incomplete paperwork. One of them, documented as a sanitary transport to the Northern District, left the Berlin perimeter in late April and disappeared from records 3 days later. The assumption was that it had been destroyed or captured. Yet a separate British reconnaissance report, declassified in the 1980 seconds, described an abandoned train of medical wagons found empty near a small harbor. Inside, investigators found torn bandages, morphine vials, and blood-stained stretchers, evidence of genuine medical use, but also a burned compartment containing melted photographic negatives and fragments of leather identity folders. The implication was unsettling. The plan had been activated, and its participants had reached the edge of escape. Where they went afterward remains uncertain. Some researchers traced rumors of small aircraft taking off from improvised airstrips along the Baltic coast, while others argued for sea evacuation under the guise of medical cargo. In either case, the precision of documentation ceased at that point. From there, the trail transitioned into speculation. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, humanitarian operations continued to emphasize medical neutrality. Allied medics, often working under extreme heat and exhaustion, treated wounded prisoners and even isolated civilians left on islands without supplies. The process was mechanical yet essential. Stop bleeding, disinfect, maintain breathing, record vitals, provide minimal nourishment. These acts were performed with no knowledge that similar procedures in Europe had once served as camouflage for an escape. The irony is clear. In retrospect, while one group of medics used bureaucracy as a moral structure, another had used its appearance as a disguise. By comparing these distinct theaters, historians began to see a pattern of continuity, a belief that structure itself could protect against collapse. For the escape plan's architects, the Red Cross emblem and the language of humanitarian order were the last shields of legitimacy. For Allied personnel, those same symbols represented duty and restraint. Both sides relied on the predictability of procedure, and it was within that shared predictability that the plan nearly succeeded. Later interviews with surviving European medics, recorded in the 1960 seconds, revealed that many had sensed irregularities in their assignments but lacked authority to question them. They described nights filled with the echo of distant bombardments, the smell of antiseptic, the rhythmic sound of trains coupling in darkness. They remembered lists being rewritten by officers who appeared only briefly, leaving sealed envelopes marked confidential medical transfer. To them, these details seemed routine, another night of triage and evacuation. Only after the war did some realize they had witnessed fragments of something far larger. The second chapter of the story, as reconstructed by modern researchers, ends with uncertainty, but also with a certain inevitability. In a world collapsing under fire, the illusion of normalcy was the most effective disguise. The final escape plan, known to few, suspected by many, relied on that illusion completely. Whether its central figure reached the sea or perished along the way remains unresolved. But the machinery of bureaucracy, which had served both medicine and deceit, continued to operate for several crucial days after Berlin's fall. And in those days, history hesitated, balanced between documentation and disappearance. No one could have imagined that the final traces of the plan would be uncovered not in Berlin or the Baltic archives, but among scattered humanitarian records stored on Pacific islands. The connection seemed impossible, separate wars, separate worlds, yet the paperwork told another story. In the island's dusty storerooms, researchers found Allied medical ledgers from 1945, 1947. Among routine entries describing first aid to wounded enemy sailors appeared a recurring note: identity, unconfirmed German origin suspected. Handwriting analysis revealed the same abbreviations and format used in late-war German medical logs. The implication was that fragments of the European system manuals or personnel had somehow crossed oceans, carrying the procedural legacy of the old regime. By the early 1952, an internal memorandum briefly mentioned the possibility that a European command-level fugitive had used medical transport corridors during the war's final days. The file ended with a simple phrase: verification impossible due to loss of documentation. It became the plan's defining epitaph. The operation had been built to erase itself, leaving only realistic fragments: train numbers, requisition slips, oxygen cylinder lists, and doctors' signatures that likely never belonged to real people. Across Europe, reconstruction teams found the remnants of abandoned field hospitals, walls marked with faded red crosses, ledgers with pages removed, and unopened morphine ampules dated April 1945. Ink analysis showed that the missing pages had been torn out days after Berlin fell. Investigators assumed those records were the last administrative steps of the escape. Without them, the narrative remained a mosaic of roots and coincidences, all plausible, none certain. Historians concluded that the plan's strength lay not in secrecy but in realism. It was an administrative labyrinth where everything appeared routine. Convoys truly carried wounded soldiers. Barges actually contained medical glassware. Only one small crate, one extra line in a report, transformed mercy into disguise. In a world drowning in documentation, authenticity became the perfect camouflage. Meanwhile, the Pacific archives revealed a mirror image. Allied medics, operating in unbearable heat, provided neutral treatment to captured enemies, disinfecting wounds, maintaining breathing, and recording each action. Their calm professionalism reflected the same procedural discipline the European escape network had exploited. Both systems were born of the same wartime instinct: the belief that order could survive chaos. The final known trace appeared in a coastal report from Northern Europe, dated May 1945. Fishermen discovered a burned medical vessel washed ashore, its insignia erased. Among the debris were sealed tins of ointment, scorched bandages, and a twisted box once used for photographic film. Inside lay melted negatives, perhaps identification photos. The vessel's registration number matched one earlier listed as carrying laboratory glassware. After that, the trail ended. What became of those involved remains unknown. Some may have died during the escape. Others perhaps melted into post-war Europe, living under identities built from precise wartime paperwork. The structure that carried them, the disciplined machinery of medical documentation, outlived them all. Even in peacetime, hospitals continued using the same forms, unaware that these formats had once hidden one of history's most elusive disappearances. Decades later, survivors recalled only the monotony of paperwork, rosters, supply forms, endless checklists. They remembered the smell of antiseptic, the lantern glow on blank forms, and the faint understanding that their signatures might one day matter for reasons they could not imagine. The story's final irony lies in its humanity. The Red Cross markings, the stretchers, the bandages, symbols of mercy, had become, for a brief moment, the perfect disguise. Yet it was through those same medical records, through the cold precision of humanitarian procedure, that history later rediscovered the echo of the escape. Whether the plan succeeded or failed remains uncertain. What endures is its warning that in times of collapse, the boundary between compassion and concealment can narrow to a single line of ink on a medical form calm handwriting that once hid the most dangerous secret in Europe.